What I thought I would talk about, it's very lovely to be invited to meet with you all, and Chuck and I talked a little bit before everybody came on, and in a way, I guess it relates to I think what Pete's intention was with that song of remembering where we come from, and so Chuck and I were talking about all the we have all these connections, and so then we just kind of discovering um, how we're connected, and what a joy that is, and it's a actualization of our community and connection, the things that we think about around that, and we talk about a lot, but that, um, as you've probably noticed, that we don't always, uh, we're missing it sometimes. So we suffer as a result. We suffer individually, and our individual suffering kind of ripples out into collective suffering, and so pretty easy to see these days. So what I thought I would talk about is just kind of like what, in a way, like what I'm up to, because I've really, whether it's through music or establishing a nonprofit or the work that I do at Macalester, and increasingly, hopefully, I think what I've tried to do with my life is to uh, make it an integrated effort towards less suffering, not only for myself but for others. And I have my theory, not mine alone, but a theory that I subscribe to is that that's really what everybody's up to in one way or another. Some of us have fortunate circumstances, and we can kind of actualize that in the world in ways that are easier to see or understand, and some of us more difficult. But everybody experiences the sand and the oyster, basically, and just on a day-to-day, almost a moment-by-moment basis, how we feel disconnected, there's dissatisfaction, um, there's also joys and all of that, but we can't maintain it. We fall short even in our relationships with the people that we love the most, and it's just part of our experience. So I think everybody looks for ways, and it's one of the ways I would characterize a group like yours. It's like a way of coming together in community to support each other in that effort, basically. So for me, music appeared that way to me really early. I mean, basically early 20s when I was playing I hardly knew how to play at all. But I had experience. I had a couple of experiences that people will call. We refer to them as flow state activities, or if it's in the spiritual realm, it's like slight insight or kind of little kinsho enlightenment kinds of experiences that everybody has. We have them in different ways, but it changed the way that I looked at and thought about music. I mean, most of this was completely, I would never have been able to articulate it at the time. But in retrospect, looking back, I realized that because of those experiences, I made decisions around music that were trying to see music as what we would call a spiritual practice. In my view, everything is a spiritual practice. I think it was Desjardins that said, we're not human beings having spiritual experiences, we're spiritual beings having human experiences. And that's how I see it. But there are some things that stand out. So it's one thing to say everything's a spiritual practice. It's another thing to see washing dishes or actually experience washing dishes, taking out the garbage. I don't know. There's even more difficult tasks than that. And it's super hard to approach them as a spiritual practice. But I do think that's what everybody's trying to figure out, whether they articulate it that way or not. It's like, damn, can I get through the day with like a little more ease and be a little more grateful, etc. So I saw music as a path toward that, and then a little bit later, um, I found meditation, mostly because I had run into circumstances in my life that were challenging in a way that I didn't know how to cope with. And just kind of, really, I'm not even sure why. I sought out meditation. Originally, it was transcendental meditation, and then I found a Zen community here in the Twin Cities, and then reluctantly, because I'm a little rogue and pretty attached to my rogue status. So I was a little reluctant joiner, but after a while, you got to admit. So that's kind of how I ended up there. And then after a lot of years, I spent a lot of years at Clouds and Water in that community, Clouds and Water Zen Center. A lot of years as a musician, fortunate to be around great people, and a couple people in particular, So Immenso, one of them, who were not only great musicians and great teachers, but I saw them as, and Soa particularly, as basically a spiritual teacher. So he really became, I mean, I can think of him as my root teacher in a way. So, so for years, I've in a way kind of wrestled with how do I integrate those two. I had these two great loves, kind of music, my first practice, and then Zen practice eventually, which not exclusively, but a big part of it is actually having a contemplative practice. So how do I integrate those? And that's what I'm still up to, basically. How do I create an integrated life in which everything I do is pointing in the same direction, that I'm not kind of, I noticed early in my life that it's like, oh, most of the time we're like, all of us are like kind of veering this way and that way and trying to center ourselves, but circumstances don't allow it, and it's really difficult. So I thought I would talk a little bit about that. So I formed my nonprofit. M2 Foundation is the nonprofit. I'm probably going to change the name of it. It's to Urban Monk Project. So that's kind of the title of a lot of the things that I do. And that's a little more descriptive of my view, which is, having been in a Zen community for a long time, I realized that while I love the tradition, I'm an ordained priest in that tradition, and that particular style suits me in a lot of ways, although there was plenty of things that I rubbed up against. I could see it pretty early. I could see it was like, well, this isn't for everybody, and nothing is for everybody in a certain kind of way. I think there might be some fundamental things that are for everybody, and the challenge, but also the opportunity of living in these times is that we can take a really broad view, and we can look at lots of different wisdom traditions, religious and otherwise, and cultural traditions. So all of the wisdom that's been accumulated, and now basically we have access to it, like carrying it around in our back pocket. So one of the downsides of that is that it can exaggerate, perpetuate kind of shopping around. But the upside is that you can be comparative, and you can really take a broad look, and you can pick and choose, because what I realized even within a Zen community, which asks you to basically just put aside your preferences for the moment, and could you just do it this way? And in Zen particularly, Zen's pretty, Japanese Zen, it's pretty particular. It's like, when you bow, this is how you bow. When you walk into the Zendo, you always lead with your right foot, etc. So lots of rules. But what I finally discovered was like, oh, it's not about the rules. It's really about, you do the rules so you start, it just gives you a way to kind of bump up against yourself and start to work with that. But the ultimate suggestion isn't at all that you do it somebody else's way. The encouragement is actually to find out what's true for you. And increasingly in this world, that's the challenge. Like, what's true for us? And how could we build a life? Like, what does a life look like that's that still has its roots in the accumulated wisdom of humans having been here for thousands and thousands of years, and the wisdom that's non-human as well? How do we maintain our rootedness in that, and then actualize ourselves as unique, beautiful beings? So it's a great opportunity, and what the Urban Monk Project is mostly about is like it's a statement saying that it's possible. It's an experiment, slightly a theory. Particularly in Buddhist traditions, this becomes a big thing. Like, it looks like great masters like Thich Nhat Hanh, for example, who recently passed. He was a monk, so it looks like, and it used to look like in all those traditions, that like you had to be a professional spiritual specialist or something to really taste the fruit of the practices. And increasingly, there are more and more people, and I'm one of them, who think that that's not true. That it's just, I don't want to diverge too much, but basically I don't think that's true, and I think that collectively, as we evolve, it becomes more and more possible for people to wake up. And we also have cultural environments that don't always work in favor of that. So what do we do? How do we do a life that creates environments that make it more likely for human beings to wake up, meaning to their innate wisdom, to an open-hearted compassionate approach to the world? I have faith that that's possible. There are examples of it throughout time. There are living examples of it walking the face of the earth right now, all of us to some extent, some of us to kind of profound extent. So the Urban Monk Project is largely about doing that. Like, well, what would it take to do it? How could you form a life, and particularly how could you form a life that isn't, I'm going to use the word stuck, and I don't necessarily mean it pejoratively, but stuck in a particular tradition? Because it seems like we're at kind of I'm reluctant to use the word paradigm shift because we're always shifting paradigms, but it seems like we're at a juncture where increasingly the old structures don't fit for some of the reasons I've already mentioned, which is like, if everybody has access to all of the world's wisdom traditions, it's super hard to get people to just stay within the confines of one particular tradition. I mean, virtually everybody is shopping around a little bit, and then you find a practice that kind of really fits for you, and it's like, I want to be able to do that. And the way that these teachings used to be passed down, the wisdom teachings and compassion teachings, it was more narrow than that, and it made sense. So it made sense at that time, but it's a different time. So, but that means it's incumbent upon us as individuals and as small communities to figure out, well, what does that look like? If it's not going to be prescribed for me by my family and by the village that I live in, by identifying with a particular faith tradition, like, well, who's going to do it? And it would be like, well, me. That's who's going to do it. And a couple of things become obvious right away. It's like, well, it might be me in a way, but I can't do it alone. So community is going to be important. It might be me, but I don't need to reinvent the wheel. I have access to lots of amazing insight. So we can be inspired by people giving talks. We can be inspired by somebody writing a book. We can be inspired by going to a retreat or seeing somebody talk somewhere. So both of those elements, the community element and kind of the inspiration, receiving teachings, which is operating on this, slightly intellectual level. So you receive some information, community is supporting you. Both of those are fundamental. You need to have both of those. And then the way that it looks to me is that where the rubber really meets the road is practice. And without practice, those other two things, they're helpful. Better to have community than not have community. It's better to be slightly inspired than to not be inspired. And you can resolve some conflicts kind of on an intellectual basis, but not that much actually. You can kind of see the path, or you can be inspired, or you can verify an observation you've had. But where it really becomes an issue, and actually it was in the little chant slightly in the chant that Chuck did, or the verse he did in the beginning, said something about love and healing. So in some ways, it's really about how do I heal myself? So all of us are subject to a certain kind of traumatization by being a human being. So we're born, we come from somewhere, like we come from a place that was completely connected, that was non-differentiated. In Buddhism, you might call it like emptiness, for example. So like when you're a baby in the womb, you're completely connected to the world. Like you don't have some concept that you're not connected. You're completely dependent. You see, you don't even see it. You're not conceptualizing, as far as we know. And then all of a sudden, boom, you're born into the world, you're breathing air, and little by little, you start to understand yourself as a separate being. So all of us experience that trauma, and then we have to resolve that kind of existential issue. Then on top of that, we also then are raised by other human beings who also are suffering from the same existential trauma, and also suffering from having been raised by people who were traumatized. It's part of the cycle, right? So very few of us are raised by a community that can love us entirely and can love us with the right kind of balance of like giving us enough freedom and at the same time giving us enough support. It's, there's so many variables. So we all are healing. We're all healing from those wounds, and what are the practices that will heal us? So I want, before it gets too late here, because I don't know, Chuck, how long do you want me to go?
Another 10 minutes would work out just fine.
Perfect. Okay, so what I thought I would do is I'll share some practices, contemplative practice basically, do like guided meditations, and just say a couple of words, because Chuck had mentioned when I asked him what he might want me to talk about, it's like, well, what's the connection between music and Zen or music and meditation or something? And for me, there's a direct link, and I already described that I saw music as a spiritual practice, but like, well, what does that mean? So one thing you could say, particularly around contemplative practices, and there's a reason that contemplative practice is at the root of not all Buddhist traditions, but most of them. But it's also in all of the other traditions as well. So prayer, and if you look at the life of monastics, for example, everything is basically a contemplative practice. Like you learn how to do eating, work, everything as a contemplative practice. So what does that mean? So it means having a certain kind of mindfulness around it, or it means being in relationship to consciousness in a particular way. So music and meditation actually track in a very parallel way the same path. So on one end of that spectrum, so when you first begin to play music, when you do preliminary meditation practices, you typically you have to work with attention. So we're going to do an attention practice. So that's on that narrow end. So like attention practice is when you learn to play, first learn to play an instrument. Like you have to learn, a physical technique, number one, and you have to be able to pay attention long enough to repeat it, and then like you learn a scale or you learn a song or whatever. So you have to have the capacity to focus long enough to do that. Otherwise, you can't develop the skill. So, and the same thing is true when you learn a preliminary meditation practice, like following your breath. So we're just going to do that for a moment. So I'd like you to shut your eye, close your eyes, and just notice without any, and you've been listening to me talk, and now you're kind of in an unknown space. Just notice that there's probably like a lot of activity in the mind. And typically that's how we identify, particularly in the West. Descartes was wrong, but he was influential. So we think we are thinking in a way. So we think we are that activity that feels like it's in your head, that feels like there's a you behind your eyes, kind of. So attention practices are using that capacity, that conceptual thinking practice. It's just redirecting it so that it only focuses on one thing, because the mind is kind of wired, it's task oriented, and then it can do one thing and it feels really good when it does that, but then it can't do it for very long and it spaces out. So we vacillate between the two. So I want you to just take that thinking mind now and follow the breath as it comes in through the nose. Follow it all the way down into the belly. Follow it back out. Comes back up, comes back out the nose. And you could notice the sensation of air as it comes in the nose. It's a little bit cool. And then literally just follow it like you would follow a wave, when you're watching the ocean or something, or following a bird tracking across the sky. And almost immediately for most of us, we might be real distracted and you won't feel it, but if you can follow even a couple of breaths, which typically that's not too hard, you can feel the body calm down a little bit. So physiologically, we're just wired, like if we can do one thing at a time, whether it's following the breath, painting, cooking, whatever it might be, we just feel better. So that's why we're attracted to things like music. It's impossible to play music unless you can focus. So it's impossible to be in the choir unless you can focus. So that feels really good. All right, so that's on the kind of narrow end of the spectrum. So it's a necessary practice. If you leave it at that, if you leave music at that, if you leave meditation at that, it gets a little frustrating because you're either doing it or you're not doing it. And like for the music side of it, for example, like what you want to do is to be able to play with other people. And you have to practice with the tension long enough that you develop some muscle memory and that you get comfortable. And like you know 3 chords and you can do them without really thinking about it. Then you could move to the next level, which should be slightly expanded. So, and this in meditation, it would be like, well, now could I be mindful without having to focus in such a narrow way? Because that narrow focus for a lot of people when they learn to meditate, it's like if they don't have some other guidance and they're not in community or they don't have some other teachings, after a while it kind of falls flat. It's frustrating because you think that what you're supposed to be able to do is stop your mind from thinking, which of course is impossible. So it feels like, well, I don't know, what is this about? Like, I don't even know what I'm doing. Like, why am I doing this? So I want you to now do the same thing. So follow the breath. So just take a couple of breaths and notice that feeling. So basically it's the mind watching the breath, right? It's like you're watching the breath, but you're doing it from the mind. So now, and this, you might get it, you might not, but see if you can unhook awareness from thinking. So rather than up in the mind thinking about the breath, let awareness drop down through the throat. Like, see if you could know the throat from inside the throat, just for a second. You don't have to think about it. Like the throat, if you have a sore throat, you're not thinking sore throat. The sore throat is telling you sore throat. So I know you can all do it. It's just not our habit, unless there's an emergency. So see if you can know the throat without reaching down with the mind. And then let that drop down even further so you know the body from inside the body. Again, that's happening to you. You can't make it happen, it's already happening. But you could open to it. And then you could notice if you just noticing like awareness in the body is like way more general, right? And then you could notice that the breath is happening on its own. And the other thing you might notice that actually awareness is happening on its own. Awareness and thinking aren't the same thing. So awareness is basically, it's filling your body. You can be aware of your entire body, kind of all at the same time. And rather than that narrow focus, now it's like slightly broader. It's like your body is like a neighborhood rather than a house. Because you actually can be aware, but not focused on. You can be aware of the body, the whole body, both feet at the same time, the top of your head. And so the argument I'm making about the way music tracks with that, this is a lot like what happens when you start doing music with other people. So you can hear your part in the context of all these other parts. So now you're doing music that isn't just about this narrow focus. You still have to maintain that somehow, but not by being narrow, because actually if you stay narrow, you won't be able to play with anybody. What happens is you start to open up. And we do it in lots of ways. So we do it in groups in lots of different ways, but music is a really clear example of it. So now from this body awareness, so feeling the energetic body, let your eyes open and see if you can feel that awareness in the room around you. That same energetic, alive, awake awareness that's in the body, that's always there, that actually is unchanging, it's unbiased, it's in the space around us as well. It's everywhere. See if you can feel the boundless nature of that. Another way to say it is like to be aware of the context of awareness rather than the content. So the content is a particular sound, the content is a thought, the content is a feeling, a sensation, a smell. The context is awareness itself. That's where everything is happening. And if you rest in context, you remain open and you basically automatically feel your connectedness to everything else. Rather than connectedness being a concept or, a story because, I don't know, we all came from the earth, etc., which, is true in a certain way, but that obviously doesn't help people feel that connected. just gives us the idea that it might be possible to feel that way. So to continue the music analogy, all music at high levels, the players are feeling this, and the feeling I described as that early kind of flow state, that's what those experiences are. When people have flow state experiences like walking in nature, playing music, can have it doing lots of different things. They can happen just spontaneously out of the blue. That's what that is. They call it, and it's also called non-dual awareness. Brain science on that these days kind of tells us that it's actually both hemispheres of the brain operating equally rather than this kind of either or binary situation. All right, I can see I've gone long, so I'm going to bring us back. That's probably enough talking on my part. I wanted to be practice-oriented anyway, so.
Well, thank you so much. We have a few minutes left, and if you're agreeable, we would like to open it up and have anybody share their reflections or if they have questions.
Yeah, I'd love that.
Great. We'll remove spotlight so we can see everybody here. And does anybody have any comments or reflections? I know there's been a couple occasions, and maybe this speaks to that difference between focus and awareness, is of being focused on something, and like something happens, like a sound or a smell, and you don't pay attention to it right away, but then once you're done with whatever you're focused on, you can kind of replay back and go, oh yeah, what was that smell or what was that sound? You know, is that kind of an example of what you were talking about? It's like I was aware of that smell or sound or of whatever it was,
Mm-hmm.
but I was focusing on something else and didn't really pay attention to it.
Yeah, I think the way that is, yeah, I mean, that's an example of it, and it points to, so clearly focusing is really important. So, and for some things you need to really focus. So, so developing that skill is extremely important. The thing you forfeit in focused, like when you're focusing, is the capacity to stay open to these other experiences. So like you notice when you're focused, then it's like, oh yeah, that thing happened. It's like, and you can kind of recollect it because somehow it registered in the body, I think. So the body remembers it because the body is actually experiencing non-dual awareness all the time. The body, so if you think of it in terms of your senses, in Buddhism we think of there are 6 senses. So there's sight, sound, smell, taste, sensations, and thinking. Thinking is a sense. So most of the time, most of us are prioritizing thinking first and seeing right after that. And because the way we prioritize thinking, and I'm sure all of you know, especially like if you're caught up in circular thinking, like you're having like you're anxious or whatever, some kind of difficult emotion, like you don't notice anything else, like nothing. And we're often walking around that way, and then especially in situations where we get triggered, then we automatically default to that mode. So somebody says something to us, we're insulted, our mind activates, we're thinking, and now we're not really taking we don't have access to like the a very broad aspect of what's actually happening, which means when we respond, we don't have the capacity to we limit the possibility of responding in an appropriate way because we're not taking in enough information. So the reason that, so when I say that like at really high levels, and particularly music that has an improvisational quality to it, the only way, I don't know, pick your person, Pat Metheny or Keith Jarrett or I don't know, somebody, Herbie Hancock. The only way you can play music at that level is to be so completely open that you're just totally responding to the thing that's happening in the moment, and you cannot think it. Like literally, you cannot think it. And the idea is, and actually Pat Metheny talks about this pretty explicitly, the idea actually is, and this is the idea in Buddhism, this is what an enlightened Buddha would be, is somebody who sees themselves as an improviser in life. And they're completely open to what's happening, and then they respond. And what the great masters tell us, like Thich Nhat Hanh and people like that, when you open up that way, the thing that opens up is your heart, and you start responding from your heart. Just not like because you think you should, because you think it's a good idea, or you want to be a nice person. You do it because that's actually what the world is looking for. So it just becomes the natural response.
Hi, Marc. So one thing I've noticed is I get that feeling from dance, where you completely sort of let go and you're not thinking about what you're doing necessarily, you're just doing it.
Yeah.
So I think it's a similar way with music.
Yeah, it's the same thing. Yeah, I think that's, in my opinion, performative arts, it's the easiest access. I think all of the arts, that's what you're experiencing, and it's why we do it. Like I wondered for a long time, like, why do people even play music? Like, how do you get across the threshold of like, the early part is so, or dance, like when you're just trying to learn how to do basic movements and you can't remember sequences and all of that. Like, why do people even do that? And then I realized it has to be because intuitively they feel the healing aspect of it really early. And so that gives them the ability to sit in their bedroom and practice scales all afternoon because something healing is already happening. They don't know where it could go. But I think that's what arts represent. Like they represent activities that the reason we're doing it is for that. Other things are functional. Like, the reason we take out the garbage is that if we don't do that, like it'll stink and it will get sick. The trick is, could I take out the garbage as an improvisational act? Like, could I take out the garbage and do it with the same kind of love that I do dance with? And that there isn't a self. And that's hard, but that's why we have practices. So we practice so that life becomes more like that.
I've noticed that several nationally known musicians are practicing Buddhism. Do you feel, or what are your thoughts about, do they gravitate towards Buddhism to have that openness when playing music? Or any thoughts on that?
Well, I can't really speak for others. I can speak for myself because that was my question. Like, for a long time, I thought I was going to be a real monk, not just a fake urban monk. And so I couldn't figure out why if music was my first practice, why am I so involved with meditation and the form of Buddhism? And so this is a great Zen story. So one of my mentors is a guy named Marc Anderson, who's a teacher of the San Francisco Zen Center. So I was having a meeting with Reb. I asked him that question. It's like, it seems like music's my root practice, but why am I all hung up with Buddhism? I'm thinking I should be a monk. And so Reb said, well, do you feel conflicted right now? Which, of course, is like that's a cue. It's like, tell me what's really happening in your body right now. I don't want to hear a story. So I took a breath and I said, no, I don't feel conflicted right now. And then he rang the bell, which means your meeting is over. And so, which was a good meeting, because then I went back to my cushion and I realized, oh, there's no conflict between the two. It's just me. I'm just trying to integrate them. And what I realized eventually for me was that music wasn't enough. Like I have great music community friends, but I needed more support around ethical issues and being able to, like most musicians don't know how to take what they learn into, or dancers or whoever. Most of us don't know how to take that aspect and then put it into our relationships and put it into our job. Like we see them as separate. And Buddhism, because it isn't around, I mean, it does have the specific practice of meditation, but the whole point of meditation is not to become a meditator. The point of meditation is to be able to take that, to be able to move in the world with that same, eventually, this non-dual awareness where you really see the world in this connected, unified way, and that you're moving from the heart. And you can do it. I got a chance to play with Max Roach a long time ago, great jazz, iconic, famous jazz drummer. And I think Max had transcended to that level with music. He seemed to, I mean, for all I know, maybe Max was a meditator too, but not that I know about. But it's kind of rare, I think, for musicians to be able to do it. So I think they take it up. And the reason I have both, and those aren't my only two practices, and the reason that I'm advocating and talking about practices is that I think we all need 2, 3, 4, 5 practices. Like, make walking a practice, because you need to take care of your body, but it doesn't have to be separate from these, like a contemplative practice, like if you think about it that way. And because if you look at monastic life, that's what monastic life is. It's a life of practice. And we think that we've thought in the past the only way to do that is by being in a monastery, and I don't think that. I think that we can do that in our daily life. It's hard, and some people's circumstances make it more difficult than others. But I think we want to move that in that direction so that we start to change the structures of our environments and our cultures to support that, so that we all could have our life could be a practice.
Well, thank you so much. We're up against the clock and we should probably close, but we really appreciate what you had to say today. And I invite everyone to stick around if you are able for our cyber coffee hour, and everybody's welcome to hang out and chat some more. But this will conclude our official part of the service today. And
Okay.
thanks once again.